A big shout out goes to Ground News for sponsoring this video. To many, the Apollo lunar lander was the epitome of the moon missions and one of the oddest looking spacecraft that had ever been built, with some saying that it looked like some weird robotized insect or fake and just too flimsy to be used as a spacecraft. But the lunar lander was very much a case of form following function, and with that in mind, why did the lunar landers look so odd? When President Kennedy announced the moon missions in 1962, no one at NASA even knew how they would get the men to the moon, let alone land them on the surface and return them safely back to Earth. Many of the principles that were initially thought of came from the realm of science fiction and usually had a rocket landing vertically and then taking off vertically in a similar fashion to the SpaceX Falcon rockets or Starship. But in reality, many at NASA and some of their contractors who were going to do the work, such as Grumman, who won the contract to build the lunar landers, thought that it should be done by a dedicated spacecraft specifically designed to land on the moon rather than a general-purpose rocket that might be too heavy or too tall and would risk tipping over on an uneven surface. The other problem was that they still knew very little about the moon's surface. Some thought that the lunar dust could be up to 10 meters deep, and if you tried to land a heavy spacecraft on it, it would just sink into it like quicksand. The surveyor missions of the mid-1960s were sent to find out what the lunar surface was like at the prospective Apollo landing sites. Results from this showed that, whilst there was dust, rocks and craters, the dust was not as deep as some had expected. Grumman was chosen from a short list of contractors to build the lunar landers because they'd already done quite a lot of the design work themselves and come up with an idea which expanded on NASA's design, creating a two-stage spacecraft that would descend to the surface and then a smaller ascent stage would take off when the mission had ended and return and rendezvous with the command service module in lunar orbit. All of this was done to reduce weight. If you have less weight to lift off from the moon's surface, then you need smaller engines and less fuel, all of which reduce the weight that would have to be lifted from Earth. Both NASA and Grumman had to try and figure out what would happen if landing wasn't quite so straightforward. If, for example, the lander was still travelling laterally instead of just straight down. How easy would it be able to tip over if the landing legs dug into the lunar surface? Many tests were done landing models on different types of surfaces and on inclines. Initially 5 legs were considered, but to help save weight, 4 legs were found to be perfectly adequate and stable. The legs also required some form of shock absorbing to cushion the landing once the descent engine was turned off. Even though there was only 1/6 gravity on the moon, it would still need a shock absorber of some type for the landing. However, there were concerns that the heavy-duty shock absorbers used here on Earth, which were either hydraulic or pneumatic in nature, might have problems in the cold and vacuum of space. They'd also be very heavy. The amount of travel which NASA anticipated was up to 32 inches or 87 centimeters. Because the landers would only be landing on the moon once, they came up with a single-use dry shock absorber, which used an aluminium honeycomb material made by Hexcel that was compressed in the cylinder of the shock absorber when the lander touched down. This would allow for a single compression stroke and maybe one extra bounce, but it would still be very light. Although the compression rate for the honeycomb material was 10 feet per second, the actual landing only exerted about 4 feet per second. So the length of the legs was longer than expected after landing. This meant that Neil Armstrong's small step was a couple of feet longer than anticipated. On Apollo 12, when Pete Conrad took his giant leap from the bottom of the ladder onto the landing pad, his first words were, "Whoopee, man, that might have been a small one for Neil, but it was a long one for me." In the 60s, it was Grumman making the lunar landers that had the deadline issues. Today, it's Boeing and its troubled Starliner, making the headlines for all the wrong reasons, leaving its crew behind on the ISS, with NASA and Boeing blaming each other. But in the 24/7 news-driven world in which we live, Claims and counterclaims make it difficult to get to the truth, and this is where ground news can help you see through all the noise of all the competing stories. Ground News is an app and website that gathers news from over 50,000 sources, but more importantly, it shows who the sources are, their political leaning, and who owns them. So let's get back to our story about the Starliner returning without its astronauts and see how different media organisations are reporting the story. On the left you will see the list of articles. Here they are all shown. On the right of each you will see the political bias and how factually accurate that source normally is. But what if you want to see sources from just one political point of view? Next to the number of sources at the top of the list, you have all, left, centre or right. Click on any one of these to show the sources with that type of political leaning. To go to the article, just click on it. To see an overview of the bias comparison, go to the top and click Bias Comparison for a summary analysis of how each political point of view is generally viewing the story. You can also search the subject of articles you're looking for, be that on any type of topic, or check out the blind spot feed for stories that have little or no coverage from one side of a political spectrum and build them into your own following feed, or just browse the news for whatever interests you in particular. To find out more and access data-driven information from around the world, go to ground.news/droid. The link is in the description below, or scan the QR code on the screen now. And if you subscribe through my link, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan for unlimited access. Weight would be the key issue for the lander. For every 1 kilo of weight, it would take 4 kilos of fuel to lift it from the Earth. In the original Grumman design, the crew cabin was a hemispherical shape with large glass windows, but the glass would be heavy, so this was reduced down to just 2 small triangular-shaped windows, with the rest of the cabin being made of a lightweight aluminium hull with titanium fasteners, which can be seen here without the thermal insulation or exterior skin. After the first revision of the lander was made, it was found to be too heavy, so NASA went through the entire structure, shaving off a kilogram here and maybe a few hundred grams there. The hull itself was redesigned to be as thin as possible, but still have the structural integrity in space and in the 1/6 gravity on the moon. As the lander progressed, the astronauts were brought in to try out the design and use it as they would during a mission. However, once they did this, they found that there were various things which on the drawing board looked fine, but in reality just wouldn't work with a man in a bulky spacesuit. The Grumman design included seats in the cabin, which added extra weight. But after the astronauts stood up to use the controls, they realized that in the 1/6 gravity of the moon, standing up would be much less of a problem, and the seats would not be required. The Grumman design also had no ladder from the door attached to the leg. It was thought that it would be easier to have a winch and a harness to lower the astronauts onto the surface. But when they tried it out on a full-scale mock-up, the astronauts couldn't get back up using the hand-operated rope winch, so the ladder was put back. The door on the Grumman design was also a round hatch. But when the astronauts tried to get in and out with their large rectangular backpacks on, they found it very difficult, if not impossible, to get in and out, so the door was changed to the square shape for easy access. Because of the small space, there would be no airlock. The crew would have to get into their full spacesuits before the cabin would be depressurized, when they could then exit the lander. When they came back into the cabin, they would have to seal the door and then repressurize the inside of the lander before they could take off their suits. During pressure testing in a vacuum chamber of the finished design, one of the triangular-shaped windows shattered, spraying bits of glass all over the inside of the cabin, cutting wires and even puncturing the structure. Technicians had to go in and try and find every last shard and piece of glass, no matter how small, because in the weightlessness of space, anything that was on the floor on Earth would be floating around during the voyage and could get into the astronauts' ears, eyes, or even breathed in during the mission. The cause of a broken window was never satisfactorily resolved, but on the off chance they changed all the existing windows on the other landers and rechecked all the new ones just in case. The landers were one of the first to be made in clean rooms, assembly areas cleaner than an operating theatre, where the technicians assembling the craft would wear face masks, gowns, gloves, hairnets to try and stop flakes of skin and hair getting into the controls and wiring. This also applied to anything which would have been left behind during the manufacture and might have fallen behind the control panels or into cracks and crevices inside the cabin. Any small bits of wire, nuts, bolts, rivets, etc., possibly even tools, could short out electrical equipment, and if they were very small, could even be breathed in by the astronauts once in space. To help try and get every last piece of debris out of a lander during manufacture and after any modification work had been done, the ascent module was put into a tumbling rig where it would be turned upside down and then shaken, and any pieces that had fallen out were counted and checked. Only when nothing else fell out was it deemed to be clean enough for the mission use. But by the time the landers got to the moon's surface, the inside of them were no longer pristine and new, with wear marks on the controls and surfaces being easily visible. This was because everything that would happen on the moon was practiced and tried out on Earth beforehand. Every switch, lever and control was tested by the astronauts wearing full spacesuits to make sure that they could operate all the controls and they knew where everything was. Because of the time pressure to get everything done before the 1970 deadline, the worn-out paint on the controls, scratches and scuffs were just left as they were because the technicians had more important things to do than make the inside look pretty. They even had a simulator that would project an artificial image of the moon's surface, which was controlled by the astronauts, and different scenarios could be played out, which might include equipment faults, computer malfunctions, and landing difficulties. But there was another issue that would affect the lander before they even got to the surface, and that was the temperature range that the craft would endure once in space and on the moon. In the direct sunlight, it could be up to 150 degrees Celsius, and where it was in shade, it could be down to minus 170 degrees Celsius. With this huge temperature range, the worry was that the aluminium hull could buckle, and many critical structures were glued together with resin. This included the Hexcel shock absorber core of the landing legs. If this got too hot, it could affect its structural integrity. So, a new material which had been recently developed by DuPont was used. This was an aluminium-covered mylar film with a gold colour, and was used to wrap the exterior, including the legs and the landing feet. Multiple layers of this were used, which was found to be a very good insulator against extreme temperature changes. Around the hull, 3 layers of Inconel, a nickel-chromium-based superalloy with resistance to high temperatures and corrosive environments, was used. Then 25 layers of the mylar film were sandwiched together to create a thermal layer, and then an aluminium structural skin layer. This not only provided excellent thermal protection, but also protection against micrometeorites. Although these layers were only a few millimeters thick, in the vacuum of space there was no air resistance, and even travelling up to 25,000 miles an hour or 39,000 kilometers on their way to the moon, this was easily capable of doing the job whilst being lightweight, but it did look like it was made out of tin foil, which many of the conspiracy theorists jumped on board with and said it was just a stage prop without taking the time to understand how and why it was created this way. On the inside, many of the walls were covered with control panels, and those that weren't had plastic to cover the structural hull. Only around the windows is where you could see the hull of the spacecraft. Although the Apollo lunar landers looked incredibly flimsy, they were designed to do just one job and do it very well, without being overly engineered. For the time, this was cutting-edge stuff that had never been done before. If we were to do the same again with the new generation of landers, they would not look the same and would take advantage of the huge leaps in material science over the last 60 years. They might well have been the oddest looking spacecraft ever designed, but they are now an icon of how we overcame the challenge of getting to the moon's surface and back home again, with a can-do attitude that seems sorely lacking these days. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please thumbs up, share and subscribe. And a big thank you goes out to all of our patrons for their ongoing support.